The International Monetary Fund has said in a recent study that Africa's continental-wide free trade area, AfCFTA, if successfully implemented, could significantly boost economic growth and improve living standards at a time of rising geopolitical tensions and climate change. In its report, the IMF noted that greater trade openness would help countries adapt to climate change and to strengthen food security, including by improving the availability and affordability of food supplies. According to the IMF, large cuts in tariff and non-tariff trade barriers among African nations will be needed, as this could increase the median merchandise trade flow between African countries by 15% and median real per capita GDP by 1.25%, or more if combined with substantial improvements in the trade environment. The IMF also found that comprehensive reforms along with the AfCFTA implementation could increase the median merchandise trade flow between the countries by 53% and with Africa and the rest of the world by 15%. Joining me now from Accra, Ghana is Prudence Sebahizi. He's the Director, Institutional Matters and Program Coordination at the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Prudence, welcome to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me.
It's my pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So we have this continental trade agreements that's signed by almost every single country here on the continent, withstanding Eritrea, of course, as it is. And we've seen some of the movements in the past several years, but there are still some delays. We're not going to see full implementation or full benefits for several years to come. So let's start with where things currently stand right now with trade on the continent and what AfCFTA is meant to counter, the issues we're having and where AfCFTA comes in to change that for the population of the continent.
Yes, well, the AfCFTA process, I can say it is started back in 2015 when negotiations were initiated. But the idea to establish a continental common market was as back as 1963 by the founding fathers when they created the Organization of the African Unity. Today we are celebrating the operationalization of the AfCFTA, which is a single market for the continent, which brings together all the 55 African Union member states. 54 of them have already signed to the agreement, and 47 of them have ratified the agreement. As of 2019, the agreement came into force. It was signed in March 2018, and only after 1 year of signature, the agreement came into force. So there are a number of progress that have been made. We have already launched the trading under the AfCFTA. If you recall, on the 1st of January 2021, this was a date that has been set to officially launch trade within the AfCFTA market. And this means that liberalization process has already started. If countries have to liberalize trade over a period of 5 years, then this has to be counted from the 1st of January 2021. If it takes 10 years, then it has to be counted from January 2021. So the process will take between 5 to 10 years to complete liberalization starting from January 2021. But we can say today, there are so many things that have been achieved in terms of making AfCFTA a reality.
Okay, so let's look at some of the trade barrier issues, because that's been a major source of issues. And that's one of the reasons why you find that there's more trade with Africa, with African economies and the world rather than African economies and each other. In terms of the trade barrier, Nigeria, I know, for instance, had major concerns around the issue of origin of some of the products that would move within the trade area and all of that. So in terms of overcoming these hurdles, and countries also wanting to protect nascent industries and very young industries and sectors within their economies, how have we been able to scale this hurdle? So you said, as you said, January 1st, 2021, we're now 2.5, some people will say 2.5 years into this agreement, but we know it is a long journey. It's going to be a marathon. It's not a sprint that we're in. So in terms of those hurdles and some of the positives we've seen in the past 2 years, what are they?
The biggest achievement that we can celebrate today is the establishment of AfCFTA institutions. Let me start with the decision-making organs which are already operational. We have the Council of Ministers, which is made of ministers of trade across the continent, and they make regular decisions on any challenge that faces trade across the continent. And these ministers of trade, who meet at least twice a year, they report to the heads of state. So a number of decisions have been made so far by the virtue of having these institutions in place. We have committees and subcommittees that address challenges in each and every sector. We are talking about non-tariff barriers. We already have a committee that specifically deal with non-tariff barriers on a regular basis. We have established a monitoring system, which is online mechanism for reporting and monitoring of non-tariff barriers. And that mechanism, which is now operational, is a platform that has been created where the business people, the private sector who are doing trade across the continent can directly interact with government officials who are in charge of removing those non-tariff barriers. We also have, let's say, trade facilitation measures that are in place. The committee that is in charge of trade facilitation is working with customs authorities across the continent to make it easier along trade corridors to reduce the time that it takes to move a container from one part of Africa to the other, which also addresses challenges in the systems through harmonization of IT systems at the border. One example, if you look at, let's start with the cargo tracking system. Some countries have already established a system that can track cargo without necessarily asking business people to offload and unload their containers at each border post. They just have to make sure they see what is going on the computer. And then once that system is harmonized across the continent, the time that it takes to move a container from one part of Africa to the other will be reduced tremendously. And there will be other tools, of course, that support trade facilitation, which are being put in place in partnership with our partners across the continent. So in a nutshell,
okay, Prudence, let me come in here very quickly. I apologize. Let me come in here. So I asked these questions to lay a foundation because the IMF is saying in their report, if the AfCFTA is successfully implemented, it will end up having Africa being insulated from the global shocks we've seen, particularly the Russia-Ukraine crisis. So I want us to go there. So the IMF has said this agreement could significantly boost economic growth, improve living standards at a time of rising geopolitical tensions and even climate change. Let's start with these geopolitical tensions. We see the moves by Russia, China, the US, other Western partners like the UK, Germany, particularly France as well, to come into the continent once again and become our best friends. And in the meantime, internationally, they are not seeing eye to eye. So oftentimes, it feels like they expect African countries or economies to choose sides in these geopolitical situations. So in terms of the risk we're seeing right now, how much exposure does the continent have when the major players are trying to play chess and we end up being a pawn on the chessboard?
Let me first emphasize that the reason why these global geopolitical tensions have affected Africa is because Africa in the past has always been relying on international community to survive, which should have not been the case. When you say the level of intra-Africa trade is very low, this means we are trading more with the outside world than we trade amongst ourselves. So if you are trading more with outside world than you trade amongst yourself, anything that happens there, then it will affect your trade. And when it affects your trade, it also affects your level of economic development. So now these global challenges that have been identified by IMF study, which include, of course, climate change, different geopolitical problems, war in Ukraine and Russia. We have seen it during COVID-19 pandemic. These geographical challenges, they affect Africa because our trade pattern is between Africa and the rest of the world. And AfCFTA is going to change that pattern. It's going to emphasize, it's going to enhance trade among African countries and reduce reliance on outside world by making sure that we produce in Africa what we need to consume, and also we sell in Africa primarily what we need to sell. And if Africa becomes self-reliant, of course, this is a journey. AfCFTA is an opportunity for the market. AfCFTA is an opportunity for investment, but also AfCFTA is an opportunity to produce what Africans consume. And once we understand that philosophy behind AfCFTA, in the near future, then we can say Africa is no more relying 100% on the outside world. Then Africa is no more vulnerable to the global shocks that can come anytime. There is one more important aspect, maybe, which is not being spoken about. If you look at Africa, in terms of transactions, we rely on international currencies. Every time there is a global shock, then our economies are tremendously affected because our transactions are done in foreign currencies, which we do not have control over. This means that the next step, when AfCFTA is effective, then Africans have to see how can we trade more within Africa using our own currencies. We have currently more than 42 currencies that are across Africa, and none of them is convertible among each other. So you have to transact using the medium of US dollar, euro, and to some extent use other countries' currencies to do trade. So those are some of the reforms, the policy reforms that we think are going to accompany AfCFTA implementation to make sure that we are safe from those global challenges that are coming up.
Okay, so I want us to look at the European Union. Probably to date, before the African Continental Free Trade Area agreements came in, it was probably the most successful regional trade bloc that the world has seen. But we hope to be able to take over that success with 1.3 billion people in our trade bloc and over $3 trillion economic dollars, or $3 trillion that are possible for us. But when you look at the European Union in the past year of the Russia-Ukraine war, you found that they've also experienced the shock, primarily because of the dependency on Russia when it comes to oil. So it seems that you can't entirely remove dependency on someone outside of your trading bloc completely, because we see the European Union struggling with some of the issues coming from the Russia-Ukraine war. So what lessons do you think, particularly in this past year and a half, that the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement can take from what's happening with the European Union, the successes they've had, and also some of the challenges they've had in recent times with the Russia-Ukraine situation?
We know that there have been steps of development in other parts of the world. When a European Union is experiencing challenges arising from Ukraine-Russia crisis, is because European countries have been specializing in different areas of production. They have mainly moved from traditional industries to more sophisticated industries. And then they have put more efforts in producing cars, in producing electronics, and also producing more added value products. Now, the crisis that we are talking about is mainly on crude oil, is mainly related to food because of wheat and other cereals that were imported from Ukraine and Russia. Now, as Africa, we shouldn't be a continent as a continent and then rely on Russia or Ukraine to import grain, which we are even able to have on the continent. So I think the starting point for Africa is at least to focus on something that we are able to produce, something that we have a comparative advantage. on. If you look at food crisis, I would tell you, Africa is able to feed the rest of the world. Statistics have shown we are still a net importer of food, but yet we have all it takes to produce food on the continent. We have more than 60% of the arable land on the earth is within Africa, but we are not utilizing it to the maximum. We are able to produce fertilizers. We have labor, comparative advantage on labor, and then capital can flow freely across the continent. We can get capital from other countries, that's fine. We can get technology from other continents or other parts of the world, that's fine. But once you put together our land, you bring in capital, you have labor, you have technology, then you can produce. And I don't see any problem if Africa imports technology, if Africa imports money, and then we make sure that Africa becomes the center of production. And then we can export to ourselves and also export to the rest of the world. I think that's the changes that we have to start now embracing within the AfCFTA.
Okay, so the International Monetary Fund has also warned that the continent could suffer a permanent economic hit if tensions splinter the global economy into opposing trade blocs around the U.S. and China. So, Prudence, how bad would that outlook be? Or because many people will be doing crisis analysis and looking at what could happen if this split that everybody's been talking about for a while now actually does happen, even though many people don't think it will happen because many of these economies are too interwoven for something like that. But let's just say in a worst case scenario basis, how bad would things be for the continent if we saw this global tension turn into two regional economic blocs, one around the US and one around China? And the secondary question to that would also be, wouldn't there be an opportunity for Africa to take advantage of such a split on both ends of things?
For me, I think this could be seen as an opportunity rather than a challenge. I don't even think that, given the experience that Africans have got with COVID and with the Ukraine-Russia crisis, we shouldn't be worried about any potential crisis between two big economies, the United States and China. Mostly, these are economies that are competing for resources in Africa. So for me, I think it will be rather a crisis between China and US if Africa decide to put a halt to a stop to this trade that we are having with both economies. Because naturally, we are exporting to those countries our natural resources that will fuel their industries, that are facilitating them to prosper in terms of industrial development. So it will be a crisis for them if Africa decides to stop exports of our raw materials to those countries. But I don't see any problem that will come to Africa if there are economic or political tensions between China and Russia. Both of them need Africa, of course, as much as Africa needs them as a market. But Africa now is creating its own market. We are not importing natural resources from China. We are not importing natural resources from US. We are not importing labor from US or labor from China. We are only supposed to import technology from those countries. So I don't see it as a threat if there is any political or economic tension among the two countries.
Okay. So as we wrap up, we've both agreed that this is a journey. It's a marathon that the continent is on. And there are some analysts who have said that the agreement will only be realized if African economies will look beyond their immediate priorities and focus on the possibilities that the integrated market and the agreement offers. In terms of focusing beyond our priorities, climate change is already affecting the continent very negatively. We've seen that in southern parts of the continent in recent times. We've seen what poverty has been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Millions more Africans have been pushed into poverty. And the pandemic actually pushed the continent's progress back on social development and, of course, poverty as well. And there's even instability that has come because of the Russia-Ukraine crisis and the global rising headwinds, increases in inflation, rising living costs. Those things are immediate priorities. So for many Africans, it'd be fix what is doing me now, and then we can talk about the future. So how do we find that balance? The need for us to be able to get ready for a trading bloc of 1.3 billion people who can effectively put in money, and then also focus on the priorities of today so that there will be people for tomorrow's trading bloc.
I agree with you. Climate change is a global challenge that each and everyone should take into consideration. I agree with you that each and any crisis that will come about in the world will also affect almost everyone equally. And it shouldn't be seen as if climate change issues will affect one continent. It is already affecting everyone. It has been affecting developed countries. It has also been affecting developing and underdeveloped countries equally. The only focus that we have to think of now is how do we respond to those challenges? How do we get prepared to respond to the challenges when they arise? And then I can say, for example, with the climate change global challenges, the production model is changing. People are moving away from using fuel to embracing solar energy. People are moving away from using or cutting trees to finding alternative sources of fuel and other energy that they need for their respective production. If Africa is prepared enough, then you leapfrog, you look at where the world is heading, and then you jump there, you jump directly there. If there is a new technology that is coming up, Africa is not restricted from using that technology. We can still do that. And I think what we just need as Africans is to be aware, is to create awareness and see where the global economy or where the global policies are taking us, and then we get prepared on time. Apart from that preparedness to the global challenging and changing environment, there is nothing that is threatening, is more threatening to African continent that is not threatening to everyone else in the world.
All right, Prudence, we'll end the conversation there. As we said, from January 1st, 2021, it could be 5 years, it could be 10 years, but we are on a journey to get this right. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.